The rain had been falling since Tuesday, and by Thursday morning it showed no signs of stopping. Hazel stood at the edge of the covered bus stop on Clement Street, her sneakers soaked through, the left one held together with a strip of electrical tape that had long since lost its grip. She was 11 years old, small for her age, with dark circles under her eyes that no child should have. In her arms she carried a plastic grocery bag doubled twice over, and inside it, wrapped in a kitchen towel, was a lunch she had packed for herself the night before. 2 slices of bread with the heel ends, because those were what was left, and a single hard-boiled egg she'd found rolling around in the otherwise empty vegetable drawer. She wasn't hungry yet. She had learned to save hunger for later. The bus stop had a bench, and on that bench sat a man she had never seen before. He was not the kind of man you usually saw at bus stops on Clement Street at 7:15 in the morning. His coat was charcoal gray and clearly expensive. Not flashy, but the kind of expensive that doesn't need to announce itself. He had a paper coffee cup in one hand and a phone in the other, though he wasn't looking at either. He was staring at the rain the way people do when they've run out of places to look. Hazel sat down at the far end of the bench and tucked the grocery bag between her knees. The man glanced at her. She looked away. A minute passed. Then another. "Is the 38 usually this late?" he asked. Hazel looked up. He was asking her, apparently. "It runs every 12 minutes, she said, "but in rain it's more like 20. He nodded slowly, as if he hadn't expected a real answer. "You take it every day?" "Every day, school's in session." He looked at her shoes. She noticed him looking and tucked her feet back under the bench. "I spilled something on them," she said, which was not true, but it was easier. The man looked back at the rain. "Of course," he said, in a tone that suggested he understood the real answer perfectly well and was not going to make anything of it. His name was Theodore. No, wait. His name was Bennett. Bennett Calloway. 53 years old, CEO of a mid-sized logistics company that handled freight distribution across 9 western states. A man who had spent the last 30 years building something from a single leased warehouse in Sacramento into an operation that employed 400 people. He had driven himself to work every day for 20 years until last year, when his cardiologist had told him in no uncertain terms that the combination of 80-hour weeks, a desk, and a deep personal commitment to avoiding exercise was going to kill him. His doctor had prescribed walking. Bennett had compromised by taking the bus. He had no idea what stop to get off at half the time. He also had no idea why he'd said anything to the girl. He was not, by nature, a person who talked to strangers. He was not, by nature, a person who noticed the particular shade of exhaustion on a child's face. But something about the way she'd sat down, so carefully, so contained, like someone accustomed to taking up the minimum amount of space, had snagged at something in him he couldn't name. "You live around here?" he asked. "Up on California," she said. "With my grandpa. Long walk in the rain." She shrugged one shoulder. "He can't walk very far. He had a stroke last spring." Bennett absorbed that without comment. He looked at the grocery bag again. "You make your own lunch." "He tries," she said, and there was something in the way she said it. A gentleness, a protectiveness that made it clear she was the one who made the lunch and that she was not about to let anyone imply the old man was failing. "But his hands shake now, so mostly I handle the kitchen stuff. How old are you?" 11.5. He nodded. The bus appeared at the far end of the block, its headlights blurred yellow in the rain. Both of them stood. Bennett thought about the girl twice more that day. Once at lunch, when his assistant brought in a catered spread from the Italian place down the street, and he looked at the half-eaten plate and thought about 2 bread heels in a grocery bag. Once at 4 o'clock, when his VP of operations sent him a chart about Q3 margins, and he lost his train of thought entirely and had to ask her to start over. He did not consider himself a sentimental man. He had not cried at his own mother's funeral, though he had wanted to. He gave to charities automatically, the way people who can afford to do things automatically do them, a standing donation to 3 or 4 organizations whose names appeared on his tax documents each spring. It was not nothing. It was also not much. He took the 38 home that evening and sat in the same spot on the same bench and told himself he was being ridiculous. Her name was Hazel Pruitt, and she had been living with her grandfather, Earl, for 14 months. Before that, she had lived with her mother, Denise, in an apartment on the other side of the city. Denise was not a bad person. Hazel understood this in the complicated way that children come to understand complicated things about their parents, not all at once but in pieces, like a jigsaw puzzle assembled in the dark. Her mother loved her. Her mother also had a sickness that made her unreliable, that made her disappear for days at a time, that made the electricity go out on a rotation. Hazel learned to anticipate the way other children learn the school lunch calendar. When Hazel was 9, her mother had checked herself into a program. When Hazel was 10, a social worker named Patricia had brought her to Earl's apartment with a duffel bag and a school backpack, and said that Grandpa was going to look after her for a while. For a while had turned into something more permanent in the quiet, undiscussed way that permanent things sometimes happen in families. Earl Pruitt was 71 and had worked the loading docks at the Port of Oakland for 3 decades before his knees gave out. He had a stroke the previous spring, which left his right hand with a tremor and his speech slightly slowed, as if his words now traveled a longer distance before arriving. He received a small disability check each month. He cooked what he could. He watched the evening news with the volume turned up high and fell asleep before it ended. He loved Hazel with everything he had left to love with, which was quite a lot, even now. What he could not do was drive her to school, or attend parent-teacher conferences, or fill out the medical permission forms without assistance, or notice when the refrigerator was getting empty until it was already too empty to do much about. Hazel handled the refrigerator. She had a system, a list on the inside of the cabinet door, updated in pencil, with what was needed ranked by importance. She had learned to stretch a dozen eggs across a week. She had learned which vegetables went soft first and which held. She had learned, without anyone teaching her, that pride was a thing you had to decide what to do with, because sometimes you had to put it down to pick up something more necessary. She had never asked anyone for anything she could avoid asking for. Until the Thursday it rained, and she was running late, and the grocery bag with her lunch got soaked through on the walk from the bus stop to school, turning the bread to something that couldn't reasonably be called food anymore. And by noon, she had been sitting at the cafeteria table for 20 minutes, pretending to be not hungry while the smell of the hot lunch line drifted over her like something from a different life. A girl named Priya slid a tray across the table. "I got extra," she said, not looking at Hazel. "I always take too much." Hazel looked at the tray, a bread roll, an apple, a small container of chocolate milk. "I'm not hungry," she said. Priya sat down across from her and opened her own lunch. "Sure," she said amiably, as if that had been a perfectly reasonable thing to say, and said nothing more about it. Hazel ate the apple. She told herself it was just because Priya would have thrown it away otherwise. The following Monday, Bennett took the early bus again. Hazel was already at the stop. She had a different bag today, a canvas tote with a library logo on the side. Her shoes had been dried and retaped, the electrical tape replaced with what looked like duct tape, which was at least a sturdier solution. "The 38 today," he said by way of greeting. "The 38 every day," she said. They stood side by side in the pale early light. It wasn't raining today, and the street had that particular Monday morning feel, not quite awake, not quite resigned. He had brought an extra coffee. He didn't know why. It was a hot chocolate, actually, in a thermos cup, because he hadn't been sure, and hot chocolate seemed like the safer guess. He held it out without much ceremony. "I had too much," he said. She looked at it. She looked at him. She was a careful child, he had noticed, not shy but measured. She processed things before responding. "Thank you," she said, and took it. They didn't talk much. The bus came. They rode in their separate silences to their separate stops, and Bennett got off downtown and walked to his office and sat at his desk and tried to remember what the 7:30 meeting was about. He couldn't focus on the meeting. What he kept thinking about instead was the way she'd said thank you. Not with embarrassment, not with excessive gratitude, just cleanly, like someone with good manners and enough self-possession to accept a thing without making it into more than it was. He had hired a lot of people over 30 years. He had interviewed hundreds. He had learned to read people quickly, sometimes incorrectly, but quickly. He did not usually have occasion to apply this skill to 11-year-olds. But he recognized something in Hazel Pruitt that he'd learned to look for in adults, a kind of interior structure, a person who had been tested and had not collapsed. He thought, "That child is carrying something too heavy." He thought, "That's none of my business." He went to his 7:30 meeting. It was Earl who made the next thing happen, inadvertently. the way Earl made most things happen. Hazel came home from school on a Wednesday to find her grandfather sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in front of him and a look on his face she hadn't seen before. Not worried, exactly, but something quieter and more frightening than worry. The kind of expression that meant he'd been sitting there thinking about something for a long time before she got home. "Hazel," he said, "come sit." The piece of paper was a letter from the building management. Rent was going up at the end of the lease, a number that was not catastrophic to some people and was catastrophic to them. There was also a water heater that had been giving trouble and a medical bill from the ER visit in August when Earl had fallen. She sat across from him and read the letter twice. She did not say anything dramatic. She was not a dramatic child. She put the letter down and looked at her grandfather and said, "Okay, let me think." Earl covered her hand with his trembling one. "You shouldn't have to think about this," he said. "A kid shouldn't have to think about this." "Well," she said, "I do." She called the building manager the next morning from the kitchen phone. She explained the situation in clear, calm sentences. She asked if there was any flexibility. There was not. She asked about a payment plan for the water heater. There was, reluctantly. She did the math in her notebook that evening with a pencil and an eraser, and she did it 3 times to make sure it was right. The numbers did not change between the first time and the third time. They were going to be short, not by so much that it couldn't theoretically be solved, but by enough that there was no obvious solution she could see. She did not cry about this. She filed it in the part of her mind where she kept things that needed solving and went to bed. Bennett was on the bus Thursday morning when the girl got on 3 stops after him, and he could tell immediately that something was different. It wasn't anything visible, not her face or her clothes or the way she moved. It was something more like a frequency shift, a change in the air pressure around a person. She sat down next to him without being asked. This itself was unusual. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure," he said. She was looking straight ahead. "If you had a fixed amount of money coming in every month and you needed to make up a gap, what would you do first?" Bennett looked at her. "What kind of gap?" she told him. "Not all of it, not the ER bill and the falling and the stroke and her mother, but the rent and the water heater and the arithmetic." She laid it out the way she might explain a math problem, clearly, without editorializing, giving him only the information necessary to understand the structure of the problem. He was quiet for a moment. The bus lurched over a pothole. A man in a giant's cap across the aisle read his phone. "You're asking me for advice," Bennett said, "not money." She glanced at him for the first time since she'd sat down. "Obviously," she said, "I don't know you." Something about this made him almost smile. "All right, first thing, separate the urgent from the important. The rent is urgent. The water heater is important, but there might be a buffer. Are you on any assistance programs?" "My grandpa gets disability." "Has anyone looked at whether he qualifies for additional benefits? Sometimes people don't take everything they're entitled to because they don't know it's there." She was quiet. "I don't know how to find that out. There are nonprofit navigators, organizations that help people figure out what they qualify for. I can write down a name." He pulled out a business card from his coat pocket. He always had them, habit, and wrote on the back of it a name, a phone number, a website. She took the card and looked at both sides of it. She looked at the front for a long time. Then she looked at him. "You're the CEO of Callaway Freight." "I am," he said. She processed this. "You take the bus. My cardiologist has opinions about my lifestyle." She almost smiled at that. It was the first time he'd seen anything like a smile on her face, and it changed her, made her look 11 instead of 40. "Thank you," she said. She held the card carefully, the way you hold something you're planning to keep. She called the number that weekend, an organization called Bay Area Family Supports, which Bennett had worked with once, years ago, on a corporate giving initiative he'd since largely forgotten. A woman named Gloria answered and spent 45 minutes on the phone with Hazel, walking through Earl's situation, his documentation, his eligibility. She was kind in the practical way of people who deal with real problems every day. By the end of the week, Earl had been enrolled in an additional supplement that covered a meaningful portion of his monthly costs. It wasn't everything, but it changed the math. Hazel sat at the kitchen table that Friday evening and redid the numbers, and this time the eraser was barely needed. Earl watched her from his chair by the window. "How'd you manage that?" he asked. "A man on the bus gave me a phone number." "What man?" She thought about how to explain Bennett Calloway to her grandfather. "Just a man," she said. He was helpful. Earl was quiet for a moment. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something in the alley. "You know," he said slowly, his words finding their path, "when your grandma was alive, she used to say that kindness comes around corners. You can't see it coming." Hazel considered this. She was probably right, she said. What Bennett did not tell Hazel, what he did not tell anyone, was that in the weeks after their conversation, he had found himself thinking about the number she'd described, the gap. He did the math himself one afternoon between meetings, the actual arithmetic of it, because he was a man who thought in numbers, and the number troubled him. He also did not tell her that he made a call to Bay Area Family Supports that same week, not on her behalf directly. He didn't know enough of the details to do that, but to discuss increasing his company's annual contribution to their operating fund. He had been meaning to do it for 2 years. He did it that Thursday, in the 15 minutes between a vendor call and a board prep meeting. He did not tell her any of this because it would have changed the nature of what was between them, and what was between them on the bus each morning was something he found he didn't want to alter. It was clean. It was straightforward. She was a person, and he was a person, and they talked about real things without performance. He had not had many conversations like that in 30 years of business. His operations vice president, a woman named Stella, efficient, thorough, and possessed of a political instinct Bennett sometimes found exhausting, noticed that he was taking the bus. "You should let Prentice drive you," she said. "It's not safe to be out there with no coverage." "I'm not the president," he said. "You're not nobody either." This was the kind of statement Bennett found difficult to respond to. Not because it was wrong, but because he didn't know what the right answer to it was. He had never been comfortable with the idea of himself as a person who required managing. He had built a company. That was what he was. The company was the thing. Stella had been with him for 11 years. She knew him well enough to know when to let something drop. What she didn't know, what Bennett hadn't mentioned to anyone at work, was that the company was in the middle of a quiet, private period of reckoning. Nothing that would be visible from the outside, not yet. But a major distribution contract that had been the backbone of their Western region revenue was not going to renew. The client had found a competitor willing to undercut by a margin that Bennett could not ethically match without cutting staff. He had chosen not to cut staff. He had chosen to take the loss and find another way. The other way was taking longer to materialize than he'd planned. He sat with this most mornings, on the bus, watching the city go by in the gray early light, and tried to do what he had always done, hold the weight of something uncertain and not flinch. He was good at that. He had been good at that for 30 years, but it was heavier than it used to be. In November, Hazel's teacher, Mrs. Fontaine, called Earl on a Tuesday afternoon. Earl answered the phone with some difficulty and listened for a while and said, "Yes, I see, and I appreciate that, and I'll let her know." And when Hazel came home and asked him what the call had been about, he told her in his careful, traveling words. Hazel had scored in the top 2% of the district on the fall assessment. There was a scholarship program at a private school across town. Academically rigorous, arts-focused, one of the better schools in the city. She was eligible to apply. She sat with this information for a while. Then she said, "I'm going to apply." Earl said, "Good." She said, "I might not get in." He said, "Maybe not. And even if I do, I might not fit in. It'll probably be full of kids whose parents are lawyers and doctors." Earl watched her carefully. "And?" She picked at the corner of the kitchen table. "Nothing. I just know what those situations are like." "Hazel," he said, with the slowness and precision that his words required of him now, "the question isn't whether you fit in. The question is whether you belong. Those aren't the same thing." She looked at him. "What's the difference? Fitting in is their decision," he said. "Belonging is yours." She thought about that for a long time, even after she went to bed. She was still thinking about it in the morning on the bus. She told Bennett about the application on a Thursday. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had learned about him. He was a good listener, the kind who was actually processing and not just waiting for his turn. "You should apply," he said when she finished. "I am," she said. "I already submitted it. Then why are you telling me?" She looked out the bus window. "I don't know. I guess I just wanted someone who wasn't my grandpa to know about it. He understood this without her having to explain it. The need for a witness who wasn't family. Someone who would hold the information cleanly without loading it with too much hope or too much worry. I'm glad you told me, he said. A pause. The bus turned on Jiri, and the morning light came through the windows at a low angle and lit up the dust on the seatbacks. Can I ask you something? She said. You can ask me anything. Are you okay? He looked at her. Why? She shrugged. You seem like something's going on. You look the same, but you're quieter. Bennett did not make the mistake of being dismissive. There's a business situation I'm working through, he said. It's not resolved yet, but you think you can resolve it. He thought about that seriously, the way she deserved. I think there's a path, he said. I'm not certain of it, but I think it exists. She nodded. Grandpa says uncertainty is just the in-between part. It's not the same as failure. He was quiet for a moment. Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. He is, she said. He just needs people to give him time to finish his sentences. The contract situation resolved in December. Not the way Bennett had originally planned, but in a way he hadn't seen coming. A regional partnership with a smaller competitor that turned out to complement their network in ways that generated more revenue per mile than the original lost contract. Stella called it a pivot. Bennett called it luck with better preparation than usual. He told no one about the months of uncertainty. He told no one about the Thursday mornings when he'd sat on the butts, feeling the particular weight of a company's 400 livelihoods, and was not sure he was equal to it. He had held it himself, the way he'd always held things, and now it was resolved. He thought about Hazel saying, uncertainty is just the in-between part. He thought that an 11-year-old had given him better counsel than anything he'd received from his executive team. The acceptance letter came in January, on a Friday, in the mail. A cream-colored envelope with the school's crest on the upper left corner. Earl called her name from the living room, and she came and he held the envelope toward her without a word. She opened it standing up. She read it twice. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she sat down on the couch next to her grandfather, and he put his trembling arm around her shoulders, and she let him, and outside it was January, and the street was quiet, and the light was the thin gray light of winter. I got in, she said. I know, he said, though he hadn't known. It's full scholarship, she said, for the full 4 years if I keep my grades up. He made a sound that was not quite a word. She understood it. She cried a little then, which surprised her. She had not expected to cry. She was not a crier. But something gave way in her that had been held very tightly for a very long time, and she let it. She told Bennett on Monday. He was already on the bus when she got on. She sat down without preamble and held out the letter. She had folded it and put it in her coat pocket that morning without entirely knowing why. He took it. He read it. He handed it back. Congratulations, Hazel, he said. The simplicity of it, the lack of performance, was somehow exactly right. Thank you, she said, for the phone number and for everything else. He thought about everything else. The hot chocolate in a thermos. The card with the number on the back. The Thursday mornings he'd sat next to a child on a city bus and let the company's weight lift a little in the middle of a conversation about real things. You did the work, he said. You helped. That's allowed, he said. The bus moved through the city. Fog was coming in off the bay, the way it does in January, rolling over Twin Peaks and settling into the streets in soft banks. The city looked temporary in it, a little dreamlike. There's going to be a dinner, she said after a while. A welcome thing for the new students and their families. My grandpa can't go. It's in the evening, and the trip would be hard for him. Bennett waited. I was wondering, she said with the careful, unhurried manner of someone who has thought about what they're going to say, if you would want to come, not as family, just as someone who knows about it. He thought about the word Hazel's grandfather had apparently used, belonging. I'd be glad to, he said. She nodded, as if this were a logistical matter now resolved. She pulled out a small notebook from her bag and wrote down the date and the address and tore the page out carefully along the perforated edge and handed it to him. He folded it and put it in the same pocket where he kept his phone. Outside, the fog moved through the city like something unhurried and inevitable, and the bus carried them both, in their separate silences, toward the day. The dinner was held in the school's main hall, a room with high ceilings and long wooden tables, and the kind of warm institutional light that suggests permanence and care. Hazel arrived with Earl on her left and Bennett on her right, Earl in his good sweater, moving slowly but steadily with his cane, Bennett in a coat that was, as always, expensive without announcing itself. Other families arrived in clusters. Mothers and fathers, siblings, the odd grandparent. No one looked at Hazel's configuration and made anything of it. At one point, a teacher, a young woman with reading glasses pushed up on her head, came over and introduced herself and shook Earl's hand and shook Bennett's hand. "Is this the whole family?" she asked pleasantly. Earl looked at Hazel. Hazel looked at Bennett. "Yes," Bennett said without hesitation. "That's us." Hazel's expression did not change, but something shifted behind it, a small interior adjustment, like a door closing gently into its frame. Later, walking out to the parking lot in the cold January air, Earl shuffled slowly between them, their breath making small clouds in the dark. "You know," Earl said to Bennett in his measured way, "she doesn't ask for much, I know," Bennett said. "She never has." Earl paused, gathering the next words carefully. "She thinks that's a strength." "It is," Bennett said. "It's also a habit," Earl said, "that she might want to think about when she's older, knowing when to ask." They walked in silence for a moment. "I'll keep that in mind," Bennett said. And he meant it, though he wasn't entirely sure what it would look like in practice yet, only that it would involve showing up, again and again, in the small, unglamorous ways that actually meant something. An extra thermos. A phone number written on the back of a card. A seat at a table where she had every right to be. Hazel walked between them with her hands in her pockets and her breath rising in the cold air, and she did not look at either of them, but she felt the warmth of the space between, and she thought about belonging, and she thought, "This is what it feels like."